Hello, everybody. Good morning. My name is Ana Maria Leon. I want to acknowledge that we're standing in Anishinaabe land. This acknowledgement is also meant to situate us for the next panel, which is very specifically on Detroit. We're going to discuss the production of decline in the city, which is 40 minutes away. We're going to start with Martin Murray from University of Michigan Tubman. And he's going to make a collective presentation with Maria Arquero de Alarcón and Olaya Chivite, also from Tubman College. We'll follow with Joshua Akers from University of Michigan Dearborn and Eric Seymour from Rutgers School of Planning and Public Policy. Martin.
Well, good morning. I think we've put together a really interesting group of people and it's been a long time coming, from various parts of the world for this symposium. I tend to look at, for good or for bad, for right or for wrong, I tend to look at everything through the lens of Johannesburg. Which is where I've done most of my research over the last 25 years. And for me, looking at Detroit as part of a global conversation about urbanism is new. I've worked on Detroit maybe for the last 2 years, so it's a very steep learning curve. And what I know is quite limited, and it's basically grounded on the work of plenty of other people, and that's how we work as scholars. And it's also the case, I think, that the conversation that we had in the last session, is that for me, I really don't feel like I know anything until I've been there and been with people. And so some of this work that particularly myself and Maria and Olaya have done is based on many visits to Detroit. And in fact, what we'll see in our presentation, it's part of our presentation, we've done I think some fascinating work with drones that makes it, I think, even more interesting from the kind of bird's eye view. So let me start, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to present for a few minutes, and we're going to see a visual representation of what we've done, and then I'm going to come back and make 4 comments, general comments about sort of my thinking about where we are. Some of those are a bit pointed, but I think that might help us shape the conversation. Like perhaps no other city in the world, the story of Detroit exemplifies the triumph and the tragedy of the rise of the prototypical industrial capitalist city, followed by its precipitous fall into abandonment and ruin. For the first half of the 20th century, Detroit was internationally recognized as the global capital of the automobile age, the first and foremost manufacturing powerhouse which epitomized the restless spirit of capitalist enterprise on a world scale. In the 1950s, when it reached its peak population of just over 2 million inhabitants, Detroit was the 4th largest city in the United States after New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Yet, like a distorting mirror, this historical arc of Detroit's rise and fall over the past 100 years reflects, in a strange but recognizable way, the shared experience of many other post-industrial cities in decline. Because Detroit has been widely acclaimed as perhaps the quintessential exemplar of failed urbanism in the post-industrial age, unpacking the spatial dynamics of abandonment and ruin can assist us in imagining alternative futures. Disinvestment and socioeconomic restructuring have produced uneven patterns of vitality surrounded by blight and neglect. Located at the desolate margins of urban life, these edges are the leftover spaces which appear at first glance to be uninhabitable dead zones. Vacant and unglamorous, These residual spaces that come into being in the wake of deindustrialization and abandonment amount to cracks in the urban firmament in between underutilized and largely forgotten lost spaces. Yet these spaces left over after abandonment are never the end of the story. Vacant land and abandoned properties may be worthless from the perspective of the original owners, but they can have a useful afterlife for others. These in-between spaces constitute blind spots, often dismissed as lifeless voids and uninhabitable gaps in the urban social fabric. Yet vacant and abandoned spaces are most often not dead spaces, devoid of all life and the possibility of reanimation. Despite the appearance of emptiness and desolation, these leftover spaces do not fade into nothingness, but instead often assume new characteristics and acquire new meanings. Vacant spaces do not suggest an empty vacuum where nothing happens, or blank slates where almost anything can happen. Leftover space is a relational term that can only be understood in the context of its surroundings. Looking beyond the ruins of distressed cities reveals other stories often overlooked in the grand narrative of desolation and collapse. If abandonment and vacancy signify a kind of displacing or displace making, then the adoptive reuse and reactivation of these leftover derelict sites represents renewed cycles of vernacular placemaking. The afterlife of abandonment and ruin offers a laboratory for investigation, a way to excavate possible futures under circumstances where ordinary people have appropriated spaces outside of official sanction and approval, often retrofitting and repurposing these sites for alternative uses to suit their needs. By their very nature, post-industrial urban landscapes consist in varying degrees of refurbished spaces interspersed with derelict, dirty, and toxic sites, the leftover spaces of industrial production. The spatial patterns of growth, remaking, and decline, unmaking, are always uneven, lumpy, and asymmetrical. These are not smooth surfaces. City building is an ongoing process where urban landscapes are always built and unbuilt at the same time. The dynamic coexistence of upsurges of investment in property in the built environment combined with disinvestment and abandonment produces heterogeneous landscapes where construction and destruction take place simultaneously. Concentrated growth coalesces in these places where social relationships and networks become dense. Correlatively, subjected to disinvestment and lack of constant attention to maintenance and upkeep, growth stalls and recedes. While much has been written about abandonment and ruination in struggling, deindustrializing cities like Detroit, Flint, and even Johannesburg, very little is understood about the afterlife of these leftover spaces. These unsightly residues of abandonment and neglect, sometimes called in-between spaces, dead spaces, badlands, blank spaces, border vacuums, residual space, junk space, terra incognita, open space, clutterscapes, lost space, and the list goes on. Presents a conundrum for architects, urban planners, and landscape design specialists. Leftover spaces are the superfluous after effects, the unwanted spin-offs of excessive overproduction of material objects. They can be seen as something that has been excluded from the primary ideal and wanted urban world, and then with the passage of time return as a sort of obtrusive matter imposed to reject or push away. Despite the widespread acknowledgement of their existence, residual spaces are extremely difficult to classify and categorize. From empty lots and abandoned buildings, from brownfields to industrial urban prairie lands, and from overgrown vegetation to derelict factories. To be sure, toxic wastelands and contaminated dump sites perhaps come closest to genuine dead spaces. But at the same time, feral landscapes, that is, those stripped of the traces of human occupation, often experience a kind of rewilding as nature reclaims its place in the order of things. Detroit is a patchwork city. where distressed neighborhoods are pieced together through the assemblage of discarded objects to produce places that serve immediate needs. Stitching together the pieces, or filling in the holes, creates platforms for launching something new. Fissures and cracks in the urban landscape have produced a perforated landscape consisting of physical imperfections, infrastructural breakdowns, and shortage of resources. What is lost in the bird's eye view are the sightings of embryonic beginnings of possible futures that are invisible from great distances. The microscopic gaze can perhaps yield a picture of perseverance, resilience, and contestation, which offer an alternative to resignation and victimhood. The glimmers of hope, glimpses of alternative futures, and perhaps the seedbeds of resistance can only be found in the often overlooked in-between spaces of the largely devastated urban landscape. These ever-changing borderlands are places of possibility. Seeing the city from the microscalar vantage point of the fissures and the gaps in the urban fabric enables us to grasp the nuanced differences that give these soft edges their socio-historical specificity. Pieced together in ways that reflect a mosaic of competing interests and rivalries, Detroit cannot be understood as a totality, but can only be grasped through the finely grained scale, or the microgeographies of neighborhoods, districts, and the clusters of streets. Because it is a city of fragments, the story of Detroit can only be told in microhistories and vignettes that move away from a single grand narrative of post-industrial decline. Specific places conform to their own historically specific temporal rhythms and the microspatial dynamics. Brightmoor, Poletown East, and Riverbend, Fox Creek, those are the places that we've looked at, are neighborhoods of entrenched disadvantage. But the structural forces that produced abandonment and ruin in these places are multiple and complex. These three neighborhoods are at once actual locations and imagined places, inextricably tied to distinctive histories and subjected to heterogeneous patterns of decline and blight. So now we'll see our film, and I'll come back and make 4 final points.
Good morning, everybody. Maria Olaya is sitting there. This is a bit of an experiment. We are going to be sharing with you a video that contains some of the material that Martin has been sharing, but it's our way of carrying some of what we have been learning when we are not only presenting in publics in venues like this, but when our work stands without us presenting on behalf of it. So let's see what you think.
This project examines the case of Detroit through a finely grained account of disparate narratives, chronicling the existing realities and projected futures, their representation and mediation. 3 neighborhoods targeted as high vacancy zones in the 2012 Detroit Future City Framework are the focus: Brightmoor, Poletown East, and Riverbend. By demarcating these sites as testbeds for production and ecological innovation, this philanthropy-sponsored planning effort set a 50-year land use scenario, recasting these formerly urban neighborhoods into seas of greenery. While these narratives embody the quest for a more sustainable future, the continued, overwhelming presence of blight and chronic lack of investment speak of very different priorities. Yet, despite this legacy of neglect and the lack of official support, residents have instigated the emergence of contested, alternative urban imaginaries. Brightmoor, Poletown East, and Riverbend are at once actual locations and imagined places, inextricably tied to distinct histories and identified as platforms for possible futures. These 3 neighborhoods are enclaves of entrenched disadvantage, but the structural and social forces that produce these similar outcomes are not identical. Pieced together in ways that reflect a mosaic of competing interests and rivalries, Detroit can only be grasped through the finely grained scale of neighborhoods, districts, and streets. Because it is a city of fragments, the story of Detroit is better told in microhistories and vignettes. Exploring 3 sites, Brightmoor, Poletown East, and Riverbend, enables us to excavate through a textured investigation grounded in history, but pointing toward the future where Detroit might be going and why. We argue that traditional land use planning approaches do not recognize improvisational activities in highly vacant areas, failing to project alternative, more just city futures. Looking at what happens to leftover spaces after abandonment enables us to uncover how ordinary people experiment and improvise, developing various coping strategies designed to substitute ingenuity for the lack of resources and institutional support.
I'm addressing you to ask for your help as Detroit embarks on what I consider the greatest challenge of our time. My administration is in the initial stages of a process that will redefine the landscape of our city. Detroit's 140 square miles, much of it vacant or underutilized, is considered by many the largest obstacle facing a city that must become safer, more efficient, and more attractive to employers and residents at a time of declining population and financial resources.
The city will emerge later today, by the time I go to bed, from bankruptcy. We will exit. And we look forward truly to a better time for the city going forward.
The bankruptcy will wrap up today, Kevin will wrap up today, and the financial emergency in the city of Detroit will be defined as wrapping up today. So it's truly historic.
It'll be great not to have to go through the legal proceedings that's been consuming so much of our time, but the reality is tomorrow's not any different than today.
What do we want? Water! And when do we want it? Now! What do we want? Water! And when do we want it? Now!
If you're wealthy enough in Detroit, you can have water. If you're not wealthy enough, you can't have water. And that's not a society that we want to be living in.
Coming up next on American Black Journal, an in-depth discussion about the Detroit of the future. How does Detroit's new strategic framework plan fit into the bigger picture for the city? What impact will it have on economic development?
General Motors announcing historic cuts.
The automaker launching its restructuring plan, and it's one that will be painful for thousands of families right here in Metro Detroit.
Mayor Duggan says former Detroit Mayor Coleman Young paved the way for General Motors to build this modern plant back in the 1980s, and it and the city are now getting the short shrift.
That we moved thousands of people out of that neighborhood, hundreds of businesses, 6 churches and a hospital, to create that assembly plant.
We did something that I doubt any other city would have tried. We have assembled almost 215 acres in 60 days without the benefit of eminent domain. Totally voluntary negotiations, and it was an extraordinary leap of faith.
You know, this is the state that put the whole world on wheels. And today we are reaffirming that Michigan remains the automotive capital of the world, and that Michigan's UAW workers build the best cars, trucks, and SUVs on the planet. I want to just take a second to put this FCA commitment into perspective. This is the biggest automotive assembly plant deal in the United States in a decade. and it is the second largest overall automotive deal for new jobs or private investment across the United States during that time. There are 6,433 new jobs expected to be created.
The Detroit thing's all about surviving. We're from Detroit, and we're strong from Detroit.
In the past couple of years especially, they've been really pushing to tear down all of the houses that are beyond repair, basically. As far as changes, the neighborhood does feel a lot different, even just visually, like it just feels lighter. I would say, so this could be my perception of just having been here long enough and being comfortable, but the neighborhood feels a little safer to me. I don't know if that's true or not, or if it was ever unsafe, to be quite honest. But the fact that there aren't as many blighted houses around kind of makes it feel a little lighter and safer for that reason.
So Brightmoor Artisans Collective, that's us. We are a nonprofit community center and small food business incubation space. So we have, our primary intention is to be incubating small food businesses, but also just to create safe spaces for community members to feel comfortable to come and share resources, share skill sets, share time, food, conversation. Through the farmers market and the cafe, those are just kind of two main legs of increasing distribution and also accessibility opportunities. So you guys are probably familiar with just kind of the general food landscape of this city as far as like how major grocery stores, what those look like. Yeah, right. So we do have a Meijer that actually just got put in not that long ago. It was maybe 2 years ago. It's about 2 miles from here, which to us, right, we could walk, we could bike, we could drive. It's not really that big of a deal, but there's a lot of mobility issues. There's a lot of transportation issues.
There's one grocery store in there.
There is one grocery store, one like large retail, like however they define it. There's one major grocery store that is in this area, and that would be the Meijer. And then other than that, there's like smaller mom and pop places where the prices can be kind of unpredictable. Yeah. They could be really high. The quality could be very low. The consistency could be lacking, like there's a lot of kind of all over the place with a lot of those smaller places. So more often than not, you find folks going to the closest thing, which is just which is the easiest thing to them, and that's going to be the liquor stores and the gas station.
The farms and gardens are defined in the zoning ordinance. So a farm is over an acre and a garden is less than an acre. Okay. But the nomenclature, it's very confusing because the city has communicated in the language of zoning to the public, and nobody speaks zoning, right? It's like its own weird legal planning thing, and so people, like, that's a barrier. And so the level of like standards and the fees should probably be relative to the level of like capital investment for the thing. But our ordinance is set up by scale.
So there was some lots right around my farm in particular where there was one company that owned like 6 or 7 of the lots around me. Couldn't tell you the name of it, but just it's like, why? Why are you just holding on to these lots? Yeah. They bought them when there was a house on them. The house is just a pile of rubble, or it's like they're not actually doing anything at that point. It's just they're speculating, right? And so now it seems like that's still happening. But also now the city's almost kind of speculating, you know what I mean? Like the city's like holding off more so than they used to because they're anticipating booms in development, and they kind of don't want to jeopardize that by selling a little guy, 1 or 2 lots that might be in the midst of a bigger deal. There still are tons of vacant houses over there. So they would just show up, they would change the locks, they would so that house, my house, remember I was saying they messed with all the water and they messed with all the electrical? It was one of those houses by the same woman who's still doing it to all the houses around me, and she actually came. I kept an eye on it. My house was literally, it was on the demo list. Like the city, they were going to tear my house down had I not bought it. She would like illegally hook up all this stuff and start renting it out to people for just like crazy, crazy amounts of money, and then just kick them out on a whim.
So Brightmoor is an area that has people have come in. There's been a lot of blight, a lot of homes being torn down recently, and it's a good thing, but there's really no discussion of new development. Now, in the late 90s, John O'Brien had an idea of scatter site housing development via way of the Brightmoor Alliance. So Northwest Detroit Neighborhood Development, along with the Brightmoor Alliance, had an idea to come in and say, hey, we want to build homes in the community. And those are more so like the frame homes, like the one I'm living in currently. And we were informed at least 10 years with the option to purchase. It was actually 15 years.
Okay.
With the option to purchase. It was a big mess. But a lot of residents, especially women, who were single women with children, moved into the community and would see.
Yeah, it's a pretty stable neighborhood. We have, I live on the 3300 block of Farm, and on that block there are several rental units, and what happens is that people come there for a couple of years and then they find a house and then they move into it. So it's a way of exploring the city because it's a fairly stable block in East Old Town. It's probably one of the more populated blocks in East Old Town. And so what you'll find is that people have lived on that block and then they move 4 or 5 blocks away and then establish their home and maybe a little, they call them farms. But where I come from, 3,000 square feet does not constitute a farm.
So we have a large footprint. We have 110 acres under our control in partnership with the city of Detroit. When we first were talking, so Gary, our founder and CEO, has been working on assembling this land for about 8 years.
8 years.
And one of the ways that he was able to do this was because of the partnership with the EPA and the GLRS. So we own Beta Farm. The rest of the land is under contract with the city. So we are leasing the land. And what that means is we get the agricultural lease rate, whatever that is. Again, it's another person's job. But the ultimate goal is that if we can maintain the land, our agreement with the city of Detroit says if we can maintain all of the land in this footprint, keeping the grass mowed, keeping the dumping gone, cleaning it up, then the land will be sold to us over time. So that's a little bit about Recovery Park. We are here not to come and take over. We're here to be members of the community and to integrate into the community in a way that is sensitive.
But I, in some ways, feel like 10 years isn't really that long. Do I have a lot of history here? No, I don't. I've lived here for 10 years, but even 10 years ago, I was like, so 10 years ago when I moved here, I was like the new guy moving here from New York City, buying a cheap home. So I feel a little hesitant to sort of claim a voice that I realize some of my other neighbors don't share. But my voice, having lived here and planning to live here, is that what I like about this area is that all the houses have been torn down and that it's green space and that there's plenty of open area for farming or having an ice rink, or that it just doesn't feel so dense and populated.
As one person said, Pole Town East and there's other places in Detroit are experiencing two things. One is gentrification, and the other one is communification, where communities are being built. And one is extremely fast and it's fueled by capital, and the other one is very slow and is fueled by human spirit. And what people want to do is build a community and build one that shows equity with those people who have invested their lives in Detroit, because there are neighbors who've been there all of their lives, who've been through what they say was the worst, and that they didn't leave. And now you have these newcomers who respect the fact that they're there.
I just feel like it's kind of similar in most of the other neighborhoods. It's just kind of depends on who lives there and kind of like what the land availability looks like. But it just seems like increasingly so as we're seeing like more development. It seems a lot like the city's kind of like really like just hesitant to be making these sales. They really want to know kind of the longevity, and they really want to be able to have those restrictions, which is fair. But I just and I'm not a large-scale developer, so I don't know what it looks like when you're trying to buy entire blocks to put up skyscrapers, what the restrictions on that are if you fail to follow through. But I have seen large-scale developers fail to follow through, and they're subsequently not losing their property, unlike people I know who are having threats of losing their property because they didn't follow through on putting in a rain garden. The differences in that, it just seems so extreme. Who's following up on these big sales versus these little ones where when you buy these lots, there's an agreement that you have with the land bank, whether it's through the community partnership or you buy it direct or you buy it through the economic development plan. Like they've got those kind of three main branches.
I've personally been disappointed in kind of what they've produced in terms of ideas or strategies for the condition north of Jefferson.
Yeah.
I also think that the format of like the investments that our neighborhood fund is making as a result of these plans, it's more tailored to really like spurring the creation of taxable property value in this neighborhood, and there's less of a revenue-oriented property value creation associated with these uses in a higher vacancy area, right? So vacant lot, you're getting about $80 a year in property taxes, and so there's no economic rationale for the city to invest our very limited resources in improvements in that type of condition if our goal is to get more taxable property value so that we don't go back into bankruptcy.
If somebody comes to us and they say, I want to buy these lots, and they just want to hold on to them, we're not going to sell the land.
Well, it's nice to see the video that my colleagues actually worked on. And Detroit looks quite green in that video, but if we went today, it would look quite different. I want to make just 4 points. Some of these are, I mean, they're all sort of preliminary thoughts, and I could obviously change my mind. The first is we need to distance ourselves from the myth of a golden age for Detroit, a period of time that implies the existence of a stable, home-owning middle class and a degree of class harmony. This golden age is usually identified with the late 1950s or the 1960s. Detroit has always been a highly unequal city divided by race and class. Racial discrimination, institutional racism, individual prejudice have long been a defining feature of the long arc of the growth and development of Detroit from the early 20th century to the current period. That's the first point. The second is we need to be cognizant of what Chimamanda Adichie has called the danger of a single story. In my view, we need to avoid undue reliance on all-encompassing blanket concepts like neoliberalism, racial capitalism, white supremacy, and gentrification to explain what is happening in Detroit. While these concepts should not be dispensed with, they cannot by themselves explain the structural forces at work that have produced the socio-spatial and cultural landscapes of Detroit in the past and the present. Third, the tropes of oppression versus resistance and victimhood versus active agency are misleading as the exclusive metaphors that identify key processes at work in Detroit. While ordinary residents of Detroit engage in a variety of activities that can be rightfully classified under the rubric of do-it-yourself urbanism, tactical urbanism, guerrilla urbanism, to lump all of these together under the term resistance stretches the meaning of the term too broadly and actually misrepresents what is happening on the ground. What is needed is a careful analysis of the relationship between land as a use value and property as an exchange value in order to unpack the everyday excursions of ordinary people into the terrain of getting by and making do under circumstances of uncertainty and precarity. Fourth and finally, the uplifting narrative of the comeback city distracts attention from the processes of the ongoing production of decline. And I just want to add one point, is that what motivates a lot of my thinking and a lot of my research is a kind of visceral anger. And when I hear this story about the comeback city and Dan Gilbert and all of this stuff, I mean, I get really, really angry. While the 7.5 square mile Woodward corridor has experienced a renewal of sorts, the rest of the 140 square mile city either languishes in a kind of stagnant limbo or has continued to suffer from decline. And what we'll see in the other papers is how decline is an ongoing process. There is the production of decline. Decline is not the absence of growth, but there are entrepreneurs and capitalists that are feeding off the precarity of ordinary people. The idea of the comeback city implies incorrectly that growth will eventually, in time, trickle down from the zones of prosperity to the depressed neighborhoods, thereby triggering upliftment. Whatever vibrancy exists in whatever form in the neighborhoods of Detroit is forever gone, never to return. The organic metaphor of growth as the only alternative to stagnation and decline is not helpful. While we call the city by the name Detroit, the place today is governed by fundamentally different logics than whatever took place 50 years or more ago. Thanks.
Good morning. That's my name. So I guess what I want to talk about today is what Martin was ending with, the production of decline. And given that this session was named after it, I found it this kind of strange opportunity to to return to a concept that really animated, well, at least 7 years ago now, animated and kind of threaded together my dissertation on the city of Detroit. But also thinking about how that's transformed and changed over time in the way that I'm thinking about it now. There were kind of three primary approaches to decline when I started working on these projects back in the late 2000s. One, we thought about the decline as a result of kind of inexorable we saw these forces: deindustrialization, globalization, suburbanization. The second was cities as these contained units, and we used these to kind of explore the effects of entrenched poverty. It was just like, hyper-ghettoization, segregation, that's what we were doing, and cities were just contained within these units. And the last was like measures or indexes that were just focused on absence or loss. So we're measuring loss of population in these pieces. And none of these really seemed up to the task, or particularly to the magnitude and time in cities such as Detroit, speaking of 60 or 70 years in decline. We hadn't made a lot of progress, and yet decline continued. So one of the questions that was there is, what's possible if we activate decline? If we examine it as a process, much as we do growth? Who are the agents? What are the policies and practices that enable it? Are there coalitions? Who profits and who loses? So rather than exceptions, which declining cities are often held out to be, what can be generalized from spaces of decline? What can we actually learn about urban processes in these spaces? I was trying to remember what was driving my thinking when my computer, if I hit the dot, doesn't work. But if I hit this, we'll see how it goes. So this is the outline I'm going to give you today for the talk. The production of decline, I'll talk about the concept and practice. I'm going to do a brief vignette about Michigan Central Station. I spent a lot of time thinking about that in 2010, and then it's a completely different thing in 2020, so it's a chance to see if that kind of analytical lens holds up. I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that have emerged since then that we both do on the ground in Detroit. The first being Property Praxis, which is an online visualization tool of property speculation, primarily used by activists and community groups. And then Eric and I in our research, and then the Urban Praxis Workshop, which is a community-driven research collaboration. So I'll get to that. So what was driving this idea of production of decline? So I kept trying to remember it, what that was, and I kept coming back to Henri Lefebvre. And that's really a lot of what I was reading at that time, because that's what you read as a geography grad student at the time. But Lefebvre has a concept of the production of space. And so the kind of analysis of production really requires a theory of space as active and as a process. And what Lefebvre offers us is a trialectic of space, that space is always being produced. And in this sense, space, in an exception to Martin, in this sense, space is never left over. If we draw on Lefebvre to understand space, it's a process, more specifically, that is produced, and by engaging in that production, it offers a way in which our analysis can both hold the premise and the ruins of the past, while concomitantly engaging its present and future, right? Its becoming and its potentialities. It holds all of these at the same time. Production invokes a system and a structure. And so it forces a theoretical complexity that must acknowledge material transitions, while also accounting for broader forces which are difficult to isolate and define at the scale of the city or the neighborhood. And it also required attention to that nebulous constellation of power, and demands of particular attention to the ways in which power is acquired, utilized, and maintained. I mean, we could use Gramsci here if we wanted to keep our theories in play, but I think Foucault's idea of power as a structural expression is more apropos to this kind of analysis. Again. So Michigan Central Station. This station becomes kind of a symbolic representation. It acts, by 2010, it really acts as a scrim in which people are having ideological battles over a particular place. If we go back, which I don't know if I can, there we go. I should mention these pieces. Spatial practice is just a lived activity in the city. Representations of space are much of what we've seen today, maps, all of these other pieces that we produce as academic knowledge. And then representational space is the ideas of what city space is and how urban space is and how we move around it. And Michigan Central Station represents this battle of ideas. It also has a particular way in which it's practiced, and then there were particular representations and ways we studied it. In this case, for example, in 2010, a number of commentaries, the Wall Street Journal. It's harder to think of a sadder commentary on a government so fiscally desperate and so captured by its workers that it might be forced to abandon property to thieves. But are they scavengers or the union? And this is placed with Michigan Central Station as the lead photograph in this article. But the union is not just about an economic or ideological battle. Throughout Detroit's decline in the 80s, in the 90s, in the 2000s, the union or organized labor also becomes a way of impinging race or governance as well, right? So it becomes these stand-ins, the union, governance, etc. Another, it's heartbreaking to see almost if war was fought there. Actually, there was, but it was a political war won by Democrats and the unions, which the results are starkly obvious to not all blinded by ideology. Again, this repeats over and over again. These are just selections of those pieces. But an analysis that pays attention to the production of decline can tell you more than this station is just a vacant or abandoned building, or is just a scrim battling over what it is that Detroit means more broadly. In fact, this building was owned by one of the city's largest land speculators, Matty Maroon. And the purpose of purchasing this building was that it actually was part of a rail network, and land around it was purchased as well. And what those purchases did was prevent an interesting company out of Toronto named Borealis Infrastructure. Basically, they take Canadian workers' pensions funds and buy monopolistic utilities. There's a rail tunnel that goes directly behind this. They wanted to turn it into a tunnel for truck traffic. Maroon makes his money on trucks, right? And so it's a giant piece in this larger monopoly game. And so it gives it a different way to understand how decline is produced, through these actual movements of capital, these different agents operating and acting. Michigan Central Station today is now owned by the Ford Motor Company. And it has a much different language around it. The mayor of Detroit acknowledged in a recent article in the New York Times, it was long been a symbol of, Michigan Central Station has long been a symbol of Detroit's vibrancy, and then it became an international symbol of decline, but that has changed. Bill Ford, the chairman of the board of Ford Motor Company, talked about the decay of the train station as a symbol for the decay of Detroit, how he would drive by the train station on a frequent basis and really bothered him, and it would make him sad, so much that when other positive things were taking place, and he decided, we are going to create neighborhoods where we can test a lot of our new ideas. And quite succinctly, he told the New York Times, to me, this is about inventing the future. It would seem that perhaps that analysis doesn't hold up 10 years later, but in the intervening years, a number of pieces happened. One, there was a rejection of Amazon's Headquarter 2 bid, or as Lester mentioned last night, the lottery ticket that Detroit tried to put out there. But the thing that came back was we need more innovative spaces and more creative workers. The second was that the Gordie Howe Bridge finally overcame all of the obstacles put in place by Maroon, with the Canadian government funding the entirety of the bridge, essentially breaking the bridge monopoly. But in breaking that bridge monopoly, Borealis Infrastructure scrapped all plans for tunnel expansion in 2015. Right? And so no longer was this piece of property in a primary place in which it was holding off particular developments that threatened these people's businesses. Again, I hit the wrong button. All right, we'll see if this works. I tried to make a video because I knew there were a lot of designers here. You can critique it all you want. This is Property Praxis, and Property Praxis is a web visualization tool that's intended to show the scope and scale of speculative property holdings in the city of Detroit. Where this project came from was actually work with community groups and neighborhoods who told us what we see are transitions. The people that are buying properties here, we can't figure out who they are. They're hidden behind LLCs. We have no way of getting in contact with them or getting in touch with them. And like a good academic, I sat on that question for about 2 years before I figured out how to do something with that. But I'm going to talk a bit about what it does and the way that we started to think about our work with community groups and this idea of praxis. For the purposes here, I think US capitalism is racial capitalism, right? And property is an exercise of privilege and power. And working with property, I think there's 2 scholars that make this clear. We can go with Cedric Robinson on racial capitalism, and we can go with Cheryl Harris on whiteness as property. But by intertwining property, class, and race, development and undevelopment, these processes that are remaking and these processes are also reshaping and remaking racial boundaries within the city. It's not an additive question. We don't have to think about that as an exception. We can understand the way in which these kinds of development decisions are already implicated in the spatial and racial dynamics that exist. The second part is a broader challenge that was kind of brought by urban tech at that time. This is 2012. Large numbers of people are mapping the city. In part, you have to remap the city because the knowledge to make a property market work also disappeared when people took capital out of the city. And so you have to remake and understand those relational properties to be able to buy and sell properties in a certain way. But one of the arguments that we often got into was that these maps, 1, are dangerous, and 2, they're presented as apolitical, right? What more political data do we have than property ownership and the ways in which that is ruled? So thinking about actual data as a social product, right? It's carrying all of our social divisions within it, particularly when we're dealing with something like property. And so the challenge for us was, 1, how do we meet community need? How do we not expose them to greater risk? But also, is it possible, using a technology and a visualization, to forefront the politics of property within that visualization, right? So that you're actually seeing what's going on. It was an attempt, as Ollie may talk about later, right, to make the invisible visible. When the mayor of Detroit ran his first campaign, his response to questions of speculation in the city was, this is not illegal. His response now is much different, and we'll get to that later. But what you see is over a third of all properties in the city owned by bulk owners operating in very different ways, some of which was gotten to earlier. But this project led to what we call the Urban Praxis Workshop. And this is where it was useful to return to that trialectic of Lefebvre. And I just want to give it seems a very abstract thing, but I kind of want to give it to you in action. In the Urban Revolution, which preceded the production of space, in the final chapters, one of the things that Henri Lefebvre is working on is he's saying, basically, mass social change doesn't come because he couldn't find the language of praxis, right? Where that praxis met between the ideation of the city, the representation of the city, and then the everyday life, much of like what we saw in Maria's video. Where does that all come together? So this is where we're cooking, right? So all of our work is community-driven, and by community-driven, what I mean is people that are already organized, already have an idea of issues that are going on in their neighborhood are the people that we work with. We come when asked, we listen intently, and we try and produce what it is that's useful or what we've been told. That means just as data is a social product, thinking about experiences of individuals in the city that are often told to you in very emotive or other ways, as being in the terrible way that we use children to test for lead, the terrible ways that we can understand rising eviction rates or different kinds of housing inequities that are going on in the market is through people's direct experience. So working with eviction defense and a number of other groups, what we are constantly told on the early edge is what people are experiencing and how they are experiencing those processes. And so we can take that back. We can think about the complex data that we've built to try and understand that system and structure and to see what matches up and aligns with what those experiences are, what trends are there. Representations of space, maps, policy, media, and law. And then finally, theory, knowledge, and I put visualization up there as a representational idea because it's often interactive. It also has these ways in which people can change. And as you've seen, power has moved to that center circle, and I'll show you why that is. So spatial practice, as I was saying, the Sentinels. So these are organizers working with Brightmoor Homes. This is basically a counter mapping project for Charlevoix Village. This is an actual eviction defense. Me or others involved with the Urban Praxis Workshop are on the ground in different ways at different times, working together as collaborators in these processes. Representations of space. Right? So the kinds of academic knowledge projects that begin to come from this kind of work and this kind of analysis. As you can see, an understanding of how property ownership was transformed after the financial crisis, the ways in which investors purchase these properties so that we understand how we get that map back at property praxis, and then finally the ways in which that influences the rates of eviction in the city itself. So we can tell you which landlords evict at which rates and which people and where they buy their property. Now suddenly we have a system and a structure and a flow, and we can think about where in this scale, how do you upstream? Where do you intervene? How do you stop these particular activities that result in these different practices? We can also start to think of other representations of space. What does a low-income housing market look like? What do the policies that we have for low-income housing, where do those actually impact and hit, right? So we can look at all of the affordable housing projects in the city, and we can tell you, well, you know what, they're not reaching the majority of, you can say, yeah, median income, these kinds of things, but we can see where that fits in the market. We can see that eviction pressures still largely persist in public housing, in low-income tax credit housing, and extend through there. So we have these different ways. We can think of representational space. Someone said Instagram might not be the answer. We thought it was a good answer. We drove 350 miles in the city, cataloged about 104 different speculator-owned properties, and attached their names of their companies, their actual activities, and any kinds of coverage that had ever been done on the state and states of their property. Marketing software is amazing. You can schedule the whole thing to just run automatically. But another way of thinking about representational space, taking that social media sphere and kind of transforming the way that people see the city around them. What's the power of praxis? What's the power when you find this praxis? So we've seen some maps of Brightmoor. This map here that we produced of Brightmoor came because of concerned residents of Brightmoor Home. They wanted to know ownership patterns in their neighborhood. The city didn't even have the full ownership patterns. The company that built these houses didn't apply to put lots together. They didn't file the right permits. So we were able to restructure this, and they were able to use this map as an organizing tool. And after about 2 years, we were able to get the first phase, seven households that lived in the first phase of this development, their home, for $1 from the city. So they were signing them over. This is the first house being signed over. There's 10 more in the process, and there's about 150 waiting behind. So the city is trying to develop pilot projects to put these people in their home. What other potentials are there? Just last week, the city of Detroit filed a novel argument and lawsuit against the 3 largest landholders in the city of Detroit, declaring them a public nuisance, demanding that a judge force them to put their property up to code, and if it was not up to code, to turn it over to a third-party receiver. That work was based on the work of that lawsuit is based on the work of Eric Seymour and myself, detailing the ways in which these speculators buy property, maintain property, evict people, and expose children to lead. Other potentials. Wayne County had to cancel a program that was providing speculators property prior to the auction. We're involved in many lawsuits, primarily as expert witnesses, though I have been sued on other occasions. Won all of them, unfortunately. But being able to sue over predatory contracts, being able to sue over these activities because you're demonstrating the evidence over time through these processes and working with people directly around issues that affect them. And then finally, this is Brightmoor residents trying to evict management staff, which was quite fun. Other things that emerge from this, right, is new strategies. So the people that we work with use the data that we produce. We use it for academic data, but they use the data we produce to think of different kinds of campaigns, to try and organize in their different neighborhoods and different places. And finally, it's variegated tools, right? We are willing to use whatever tool those we're working with want to use. So in some cases, it's door-knocking maps, running like it's very similar to a political campaign. What people in your neighborhood are likely to face eviction or foreclosure in the next 3 months? Here are the 200 doors you need to knock. In other cases, it's online web maps detailing particular kinds of constructions. And in the last one, it's helping empower the tenants to understand that they can fight back against a particular landlord, or that their struggle is tied in to other struggles in other parts of the city. So I will leave it at that. Thanks.
So I'd like to thank Josh for doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of getting some of these concepts out that we've been working on for thinking about the production of decline, denaturalizing the processes, the systems, and the structures that produce the landscape that's often taken for granted as the inevitable consequence of economic restructuring, suburban expansion. So I'm going to present pieces of work that I have been continuing since my time here as a PhD student, and some of it I've been working on independently, some with Josh. Much of the work is framed under the rubric of post-foreclosure transitions in neighborhoods and thinking about what these transformations born out of foreclosure, speculative investment mean for housing insecurity, displacement, eviction, and also the production of decline. I want to begin by providing a bit of brief historical context, particularly for how I think about these issues, particularly through the moments of redlining, predatory land contracts, the Section 235 program, and how we see the return of these types of practices, but new and in more expansive forms, and they have disastrous consequences for the city. So it's going to be a bit of a dour talk, to be honest with you. So you've seen some of these representations of the population change in Detroit and its region already today. So the figure on the left shows Detroit's decline in population since 1940, as well as the diverging fortunes of its metropolitan suburban areas. So we see these diverging lines after 1950, much of that growth in the suburbs coming at the expense of the city of Detroit itself. And for those of you who are visiting from another city or country, I thought I would also show where Ann Arbor is there on the map, and that little teal blob there, well west of the city of Detroit, about 40 miles. So Detroit's decline is sometimes portrayed as this overdetermined, if not entirely inevitable outcome of economic restructuring and suburban expansion. According to this narrative, basic industry fled to low-wage production sites, while those with adequate resources moved up and out of the city, leaving Detroit's inner core to fall fallow in the face of evaporating demand for housing. But this is a particularly partial account that fails to countenance the specific ways in which decline is produced, reproduced, and manifested in Detroit and Detroit-like cities. I'd wager that many of you have seen redlining maps, one of these homeowner loan corporation maps, if not for Detroit, certainly another city. So here we see the areas designated as unworthy of investment, too much of a risk, and should therefore be cut off from the advantages of federally insured mortgages. So redlining withheld conventional credit from these neighborhoods while government-backed loans absorbed risk for white families, fueling the suburban expansion that's manifest in that population trend I showed you in the prior slide. So through redlining, decline became a self-fulfilling prophecy and further rationale for exclusionary settlement patterns. But within this dual but interdependent set of housing markets, predatory practices flourished in artificially credit-starved communities, further patterning contingent geographies of disinvestment and decline. In Chicago, Detroit, and elsewhere, blockbusting real estate investors preyed on white fears of falling property values in the face of racial transition, picking up homes at substantial discounts. In turn, they sold these properties to African American households via predatory land contracts. The terms of these contracts withheld the deed from the buyer until the balance was paid in full, but that moment rarely came, if ever. These instruments were designed precisely in order to have those quote-unquote buyers removed from the properties so that they could repeat these processes ad infinitum. Large down payments followed by substantial monthly installments placed most buyers on the edge of affordability, and with one late payment, buyers could be summarily evicted, as depicted here during a Chicago Buyers League rent strike. Organizing against predatory land contracts and similar predatory financial arrangements that proliferated in redline communities contributed to the growth of the community development movement and the passage of vitally important fair lending and fair housing laws. But these practices persisted and in fact were in some ways enabled and abetted by new forms of predatory inclusion in formerly redlined communities. This is apparent in the outcomes of the federal Section 235 program, which channeled mortgage insurance to loans insured for the sale of properties in formerly redlined areas. White real estate operatives sold dilapidated homes at artificially inflated prices to low-income African-American home buyers. When the borrower was defaulted, the lenders promptly foreclosed and collected these hefty insurance payouts, again, on these properties that were overassessed. And no city was hit harder by this practice than Detroit. And I need to acknowledge the work that this discussion is informed by and builds on, particularly Family Properties by Beryl Satter, and also the very recent book, Race for Profit by Keonga Taylor. Family Properties is about the Contract Buyers League in its history, and Race for Profit is about the Section 235 program. So I very much endorse these books for you for an understanding of the production of decline. So in the wake of the Section 235 scandal, there was some reform. There was the passage of the Community Reinvestment Act and a few other vital, important pieces of legislation that incrementally and unevenly extended conventional home loans to previously redlined areas. But simultaneously and on a parallel path, we see growing deregulation of financial services industry, including the home mortgage lending market. We see an increase in subprime loans beginning in the late 1990s in cities like Detroit across the country. So we see this return of predatory inclusion. It was based on new technologies about how to identify these particular markets that could be exploited, particularly places like Detroit, where you had a large number of homeowners, folks who were able to buy their homes, especially in the 1990s, but didn't have a lot of cash on hand. So they were targeted for these predatory cash out refinance loans that are really important in, well, I should say, critically damaging in terms of the consequences for foreclosure and repossession. So I'm going to get a bit into some of the results of the analysis that I've been working on, some of this with Josh. To provide a little bit of context to this backstory of the post-crisis transformation, I want to talk about the crisis and what led up to the crisis itself. So this map shows the greater Detroit region, including Genesee County, where Flint is located. And so this map shows the subprime share of home purchase loans between 2004 and 2006. These were the peak years of subprime lending. For those of you who are very much aware of the subprime lending crisis, I could have easily shown a map of subprime home refinance loans, but it would look identical. And so we can see that, so this map is showing quintiles. So we have all of the census tracts in these areas organized into 5 buckets of equal size. And we can see that in that highest category basically delineates these majority African American cities of Detroit, Flint, Pontiac, north of Detroit, and Inkster and Wayne County. And so here I'm just showing the top 20 and the bottom 20, clearly showing these racial patterns of predatory inclusion and white supremacy. Here we see the representation of the percent African American in these same neighborhoods. Subprime lending gave way to mass repossession and foreclosure. This figure shows the large concentration of properties that are repossessed in the city of Detroit compared to its inner ring and outer ring suburbs. So the further out you went, the further into these territories of affluence, those places were subject to less risk, fewer subprime loans, and therefore fewer repossessions. Once taken into inventory by a large financial institution or by the federal government, these properties were often bundled and sold at discount to out-of-state investors, out-of-country investors, and to those who had long operated at the margins as slum landlords and predatory speculators. I haven't even yet talked about the tax foreclosure sale, but this figure shows that roughly 60% of the properties that were sold after a mortgage foreclosure were sold to an investor, and 90% of those properties that were sold at tax auction in this 2005 to 2015 period were purchased by an investor. And the practices of these investors continues this destructive churn of properties. The upshot of this figure is that investors and investors of increasingly large size, their properties were just as likely to later be repossessed for tax foreclosure as not. And so these operators who are buying properties in bulk would employ practices like predatory land contracts again, renting properties without maintaining them, extracting rents while allowing those properties to fall into tax foreclosure, or doing nothing with those properties at all. This was a portfolio operation. The practices of these investors are very much entangled with vacancy and the production of decline in the neighborhoods in which those properties are concentrated. In the top left panel here, we see the difference in the neighborhood vacancy rate for Detroit neighborhoods between 2000 and 2017. Every neighborhood saw an increase, and some saw substantial increases in the vacancy rates during this period. This is not natural, inevitable, inexorable. This is produced through these practices of these investors, through these bulk buyers, and through the practices of the institutions, including Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and HUD, who are responsible for selling all of those properties they had repossessed during the foreclosure crisis. And so what's happened in Detroit is very much a tale of two foreclosure crises. Just a few years after the peak of the mortgage foreclosure crisis in 2006, we see this increasing escalation in properties repossessed through tax foreclosure. So this is showing just residential properties in the city of Detroit. They're repossessed through these two mechanisms. First, mortgage foreclosure, and then through tax foreclosure. This figure also shows that after 2008, we see there are more land contracts filed. Few of them are actually filed. Just those that were filed with the county recorder exceeds the number of mortgages of any type originated in the city of Detroit. So the only type of credit that is extended in the city is predatory credit that contributes to the production of decline. This figure just simply shows the extensive scope of the acquisitions of these investors in Detroit. This is showing where investors are purchasing properties through the tax foreclosure auction, contributing to the destruction of these neighborhoods. And we see the return of land contracts. And so Josh and I have been working hard to identify the scope and scale of this activity because there is no requirement that they are actually recorded with the county assessor's office. So we've been trying to assemble all the different names of the LLCs that they operate under so that we can begin to piece out the scale of these activities. This map shows where investors purchasing properties, those who specialize in selling them on predatory land contracts, were active in buying properties in the Detroit Tri-County area, again contrasting it with the underlying racial distribution of the neighborhoods. So it's clear patterning. And this is something that has happened perhaps to the most extreme extent in Detroit, but Detroit is not alone. These patterns of investment, destruction, and predatory inclusion are also manifest in cities like Cleveland, St. Louis, Indianapolis, Memphis, and elsewhere. And whether these investors are selling properties via land contract or whether they're renting these properties, it all leads to housing insecurity, displacement, and eviction. So this table shows a relationship between the number of properties purchased at tax foreclosure auction and those that are later linked to an eviction. So more than half of the properties that were purchased at the tax auction later had at least one eviction on those properties. Many properties that are purchased at the auction are never even rented. So actually the scale of this activity, the housing insecurity on these rental properties that are being produced through this auction is even more severe. So I want to conclude just by suggesting that by understanding these practices, these processes, it can help us move upstream and denaturalize some of these conventional narratives used to explain Detroit and its current conditions. Right, these patterns of disinvestment and decline are not given. They're produced and reproduced by systems and structures of accumulation predicated on race and space-based differentiation. These leftover spaces remain active sites of speculation and exploitation, even if it's more difficult to see. And delineating these pathways moves responsibility upstream, illuminating contingent elements and generating observed patterns of disinvestment and decline. Thank you.
Hi, so I want to invite all the presenters to come forward. And I'm actually going to go into teacher mode and use a pedagogical strategy by Indigenous scholar Eve Tuck. We've had 2 panels in a row, so I'm going to ask the audience, I'm gonna give you 2 to 5 minutes. If you have a question, just break up into the 5-person groups. If you have a question, peer review your question, make sure it's a question. And if you don't have a question, you may want to formulate a question together in these sort of small 5-person groups. So I'm giving you 2 to 5 minutes to produce questions, and then we'll hear those questions and try to answer them together. That's really good.
Basically, she put everybody to talk to each other and generate questions.
That's great. Well, I'm filing that one away.
Am I supposed to push this thing?
No, it's okay.
I think that what you've done is you've really moved the conversation in a very different direction, which is really, really good. Which is like, again, taking this whole issue of decline as something that really itself has to be explained.
Yes.
I think it really opens up a whole new conversation that hasn't been had before. Because decline usually and abandonment is just like
right.
We tried to do it in our own aesthetic kind of way, but you did it with numbers.
Yeah,
I think
we've been doing.
Both are good.
Yeah.
No.
Well, that's why it's complementary. We have the theoretical provocations.
We've never tried to. Have we ever tried to do talks back to back? I mean, we've been on.
We've been on things together, but we haven't quite set it up, strategized together.
Yeah.
That's fine.
You have 1 more minute for your questions. Yeah, how are we doing? Yeah, we're doing well? Do we have questions that are questions? This group looks like they have a question.
So I'll ask the sort of first part of this question, and it's a question I've asked previously, and it's a little bit of a provocation, but it's should cities be allowed to die without keeping them on life support, and what becomes strategies for de-urbanization as opposed to always sort of supplementing existing conditions of de-urbanization with growth.
And then the second part of this question is if we can accept this to some degree, and it's up for discussion obviously, what is the agency of design within a healthy shrinkage? So I was actually super impressed by the videos and the O-tones, in the cafe. There was a really liveliness that was related to the new, let's say, economies, even if they are micro landscape economies that are emerging in these empty sites. So what can design do to help to make this better?
Everybody looking at you.
Okay, sure. I'll take the first half, maybe take the second half. Yeah, so should cities be allowed to die? I mean, we can take that as a very academic question. We can just say, like, look, federal government transfer payments, over time, like cities decline, but they don't actually die, and right. We could say that, or we could say, let them die. But generally, the approach that I have to cities and to Detroit is that cities are people and networks, and people make decisions in different ways about where they should be, which means maybe there are policies that put people in safer and better places. I mean, the lead work that we've been doing in Detroit, almost all of the housing is pre-1979. It's incredibly dilapidated, wood-framed housing. One of the solutions could be like, why don't we just go ahead and make the Fair Housing Act of '68? Why don't we follow through on that promise of just desegregating the suburbs and move people into post-79 housing? But at the same time, for those people that are in the city, or like myself, they may not necessarily want to leave, right? There's all kinds of attachments that people have to place that have nothing to do with the city itself, right? So I'll give a brief anecdote. One of the things I was doing in 2010 was following a planning project on the Lower East Side. One of the most amazing things that would come from that were older residents that had been there a long time, and they said, I don't care if the city survives. I don't care if the city provides services. I fought for this place, and I'm going to hold this place no matter what is left around it, and I want my family to have this place, right? And so land and property and placement is caught up in all kinds of struggle and meaning. So do you want to take one second?
Be understood, maybe there was a misunderstanding. So it's not about killing it, it's about when there is shrinkage, when there is so much vacancy, and people decide to stay and others decided to leave, is there a healthy way of treating these vacant lands so that they are more productive?
So it's also, it comes on if the idea, initially cities evolved for particular reasons at a certain moment in time, and places that were once healthy forests, right, became cities. So we had no trouble with deforestation to make for cities, but it's now a question of, who become the leaders? Like, is it landscape architects and environmentalists that say, no, well, what's the strategy for the urban archipelago? Or what's the strategy, urban agriculture, urban reforestation, et cetera, that become new models rather than always, and thinking not growth, like not trying to resuscitate, but thinking the other side, and what are new models to do that?
Well, that was, initially that was the motivation for our selection of these three neighborhoods. They were particularly targeted as these spaces for innovation. And it was at a time in which the city, as the mayor pointed out in the video, was aware that land was by far the main resource that the city had, but at the same time, the amount of vacancy was also the largest problem that the city needed to face. So 7 years later, because we have been working on, this project is in the infancy, even in the way in which you saw the videos coming together, we were trying to stitch things to offer you an overview. We wanted to see what has happened, what the ambitions of this plan that, as the last person that we were interviewing was saying, we put forward a lot of diagrams, but we didn't have the capacity for actually putting forward the amount of land stewardship that is necessary given the scale of the issue in Detroit. And much of what we encounter is that we are making the diagrams, but we don't have enough resources, enough financial resources going on to those kinds of innovations, not even for them to play at scale. Things are happening at such a smaller scale. You see how many residents are talking about trees and greenways. They selected to be in Detroit or to come back to Detroit because, in many cases, they have radical environmental agendas that they see can take place in a city like Detroit. But then at the same time, you see that there are many that are trying to also innovate, and they're having a lot of struggles to access the land, to be able to piece together enough resources and enough funding to move forward these smaller urban agriculture operations into something a little bit more consistent. So we are very much being patient. I think that's something that as designers we don't always do, just sit and listen. It's a little bit of ethnographic work because much of what we see through media and through planning are, mediated imaginations of mediated agendas for the future. But when we talk to people, we discover many other imaginations and many other ways of moving around. So what I see as designers, and I'll turn back to you later, what I see as designers is that we need to be serious about gaining on the tools that other disciplines have been using for a long, long time, but also understanding how, our colleagues are also helping us to do something that I think as designers we do very well, that is help others visualize what is happening. For us, entering in conversations with Eric and Josh about how they are actually addressing and explaining us back how decline is not an outcome, it's actually an active production. The investment is going to produce decline as it is not going so robustly to produce innovation, right, in the areas that we have been looking at. So I think that's part of what we have at stake here. First, how designers can set an agenda about bringing those, disparate imaginations and imaginaries about, the present and the future. And then I think we need to insert ourselves very, very carefully in the ways in which we may think how to move forward. Is the co-production of new ideas. It's not about our, designers' imagination. It's about how we need to actually go down and be serious about the co-production of new knowledge, but also new spaces.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to just kind of follow up on I think one of the questions that we talked about was regarding visualization, and I was kind of interested, maybe from Joshua, but Maria as well, the way that what other work needs to be done between the visualizations to really empower the communities. Are the visualizations, if you could kind of assess the effectiveness of the visualizations and the other tools that you provide communities with, and maybe what you also do in between, and talk about what other strategies that you've been using to actually empower communities.
Yeah, the steps with the visualization. So, yeah, building that first map was very organic and very much an experience, and part of it was being responsive to thinking about it in kind of three scales in some ways. Like, one, what is the academic knowledge that's produced from this? We need to understand low-income housing markets and speculative activity. Two, that first map that's kind of up there where you see everything, just kind of refer to that as an oh shit map, right? Like, it doesn't really tell you anything except that it's a problem. And that is kind of the provocation, the intent to get others involved. And then as you burrow down into that map, you can actually, and we tested this a lot working with Allied Media Project and the GIS, community GIS mapping program that they have. And because we just wanted to know what people would say, right? Like, you're in my business, like, why are you there? And we made sure to pull a bunch of people out. But what we found is that the first thing that people would do was scroll into their neighborhood or their block. And the next thing they would do is click on a house that was a problem. And then the third thing they did, which we didn't expect, which made us really excited, was, oh, that's what's been going on with that place. Right? Like, they just, like, it was suddenly, like, it clicked that it was in this broader network and how they would use it. How do people use it? Community members, anybody can grab it. We make the data available. But the users that we found to be most active are nonprofits and housing advocates and activists. So people that are already trying to work on those problems, it helps provide data and a framework to think about it. Now, from that map and those connections that we made, a lot of the work that we do now is through request and contact or referral. And I showed one map up there that we did the door knocking campaign, but in other cases, I showed that counter mapping workshop we did, but those maps a lot of those maps that we do don't circulate. So the kind of the agreement that we come with is this is yours, and you can share how you want or not. Because sometimes they ask for things that would be really great for a developer. Like, we want to know this. Is like, are you sure you want that? But it is. It is that work of just going in, working with them, developing it, and then through the database that we've been able to build, we can answer some of the other questions they have and represent them in that way. And so you have that public-facing project, but through the other organizations and groups that we've worked with, there's a level of there's a reason that everything is branded that way, not because we thought it was really cool to brand ourselves. But what we found is that within community groups, they trust that the work is for them and theirs, and so we pass it around in that way. And then, we're willing to try and think about other ways of getting to the answer. So it is, it's almost like consultation, I guess, yeah.
Yeah, in the back.
Hi, I'm David Porter. I'm from the English department, and so have something of an outsider's perspective on the conversation, which I've really enjoyed. I just want to make two quick observations and then raise a question that comes from the combination of them. One, the first observation as a literature person was that for a panel, or for a morning of panels at Taubman College, I was struck by the extraordinary density of conversations about metaphors, narratives, and stories of various kinds. We have ethnographic narratives, we have historical narratives, we have theoretical narratives, we have all sorts of critiques of various dominant metaphors and so on. So just observation one, and then observation two was that there's a lot of talk about infrastructure, perhaps less surprisingly, whether it's residential infrastructure or water infrastructure and so on. And I guess putting those two observations together, I find myself wondering about the extent to which it might be useful to inject in some of these conversations the category of narrative infrastructure as a component of futures, histories and futures of community development, right? Just as the collapse of residential infrastructure or water infrastructure can lead to the demise of the fabric of community, so also the decline of narrative infrastructure that we see, for example, in the collapse of journalistic ecosystems in a city like Detroit, also precipitate that kind of decline and perhaps require similar kinds of efforts to reconstitute infrastructure deliberately through story making, place-based story making. Question mark.
No, don't point at me.
Don't know that I have a particular response to
Our panel is having a group meeting themselves.
Well, we are trying to be, I don't know, democratic in the panel too. I think a lot of what we do here at Taubman, mainly related to urban, it could be urban design, urban planning, urban studies, is actually spend a lot of time developing narratives and being very careful on what are the audiences that we are, developing our work for, but also how we are situating our voices. I think not in research, particularly in teaching, that's one of the most important things that is happening in that third floor, that for many is a space of estrangement. That's the studio space where we spend pretty much every minute trying to work with our students in making sure that they develop a sense of agency in the work that they would do here, but as citizens. So I think part of what you are pointing out about this investment in how we tell stories, who is telling the stories, what are the voices that get amplified, what are the voices that are getting silenced, and then how we situate our agency as planners and designers that are by definition interested in actionable interventions, how we carry a little bit that sense of responsibility of, knowing how to situate ourselves especially, but also more and more, I think, socio-politically. That's something that, our students are also gaining, I think, more confident in how they engage into that. So I didn't take it as a question, I take it more as an observation, and I think that's a very fair observation, and yeah, we hope to have more opportunities to have, many other disciplines across campus helping us to get it right.
I think we have time for one quick question. Yeah, a couple? There's 3 questions. What is this?
We'll just field all 3.
Okay, let's have the 3 in a row, and then they'll answer.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful conference. There is in Detroit the emergence of 900 community gardens. So that comes with the whole infrastructure, and it is not building, but it is communities. So we need to take that in consideration. Don't you think?
Thanks. So my question's a little longer. This is not short.
You got to do the box, man.
Okay.
Ask the question.
All right. So I had some questions for mainly, I guess, Eric and Josh about speculators in Detroit. So I was wondering, has there been a substantial amount of political will and attempt to crack down by Detroit and Wayne County on speculators? And then what taxes have been utilized, and what are the key differences in dealing with the larger bulk buying LLCs that are more obvious, like bad actors, versus the small party speculators that jump in trying to make a buck, basically, on the real estate hustle? And then what are the limits and power of these regulations that they might try to enact? Like, do they really have teeth, considering like economic and fiscal restraints?
So as an aside, I think the idea of taking more than one question at a time would probably be good going forward for the rest of the panels, because it just takes too long to answer each question you're getting. This is actually from the both of us. We both spent time in Baltimore, and Baltimore has dozens of identifiable neighborhoods, but in Detroit, it doesn't quite work like that. We were wondering, when you all think about neighborhoods as you're talking about the city of Detroit, what are you thinking about?
Let me just start something. I just want to make a sort of a general comment. I mean, I think just as certainly for myself that investigating this particular problem, I found that the processes of decline are very complex and are historically specific to Detroit. Detroit's not exceptional, it's not unique, but it does have very historically specific forces that produce the decline. And I think that's the same way we need to look at like alternative futures. Rather than coming up, I guess that I'm not so enamored by the sort of siren song of, you know, go start an urban farm, an urban agriculture, or entrepreneurship, or the sort of answers to the new Detroit. The next song that's going to come is going to be Quicken Loans, and Dan Gilbert, once the land is cleared, is going to say, take out a loan from me, and this will rebuild Detroit. And so I think we need to be really cautious about these kind of simplified solutions to the future.
Okay. Yes, there are a lot of gardens, and we should recognize them. There are. To Les's question, I mean, when I work with neighborhoods, they're just defined by the group that we're working with. Generally, in my analysis, whatever the area they say they're at, that's where they're at. And oftentimes that's a block club just saying like, this is what we cover, or something along those lines. It is an interesting question though to think about what does the neighborhood mean in that context. In a historical context, people attach to a particular geography and area, but in the present context, you were talking about your cab driver, right? And like what his neighborhood is like now, and that's a completely different place. To John's question, what was political will like? Yeah, I forgot to follow that up, right? The mayor says speculation is not illegal in 2013. Just last week, he's suing the largest speculators in the city as a public nuisance. That's a massive sea change in about 7 years. But it's novel. It may not get past the court. And that's really just stemming from like one person working in the legal office that thinks that's a great idea. There is some efforts to crack down. There was a rental ordinance put in place. The city is underutilized in terms of inspectors, or doesn't have enough inspectors. 36th District Court won't enforce particular parts of that ordinance. But the other thing is these property markets are dynamic. So every time we see a response, particularly like in land contracts, so when the legislature started to move 2 years ago on basically strengthening land contracts, we saw everything move to contract for deed and lease to own, right? And so these operators are not really contained by law. They don't pay blight tickets. They're looking for ways to externalize the costs of their operation, and they're looking for instruments that allow them to continue to exploit. And so it's something, policy and law is often very reactive. So it's something that is difficult to get in front of, and that's why organizations like Detroit Eviction Defense, United Community Housing Coalition, and any of these numbers of other people that are out there are both trying to create a safety net for people facing it, but then also to organize around confronting these kinds of operations in the city.
Thank you so much. I'm really struck with Martin's differentiation between land and property, and I think it's a very useful framework going forward and thinking about these different, very complicated network of agents, both human and non-human actors operating in this landscape, as we sort of think through decline not only being produced, but a whole other series of operations and actors moving forward, both resisting and navigating those paths. We're going to break for lunch